Good day everyone, so hope you're doing really well. So let's talk about Yae Miko's apparent problems and why they're not really apparent problems. So some of the things that we need to appreciate about Genshin Impact is that there's a lot of micro details that can have very substantial consequences in the game. So for instance, understanding how a certain artifact passive can play well with a different character, how like little substats distributions and all these sorts of things can affect your overall DPS. There's lots of little small things like that. There's also some macro issues. For instance, what type of team are you running? Is it a hyper carry? Is it a taser team? Is it a freeze team? Is it like a reverse melt? There are all these sorts of macro elements as well, and theory crafters are typically very good at marrying the two. So how do you manage the micro and the macro? But behind all of this, there are certain assumptions, and I would even call them biases, that I still see that are apparent with the community and even with theory crafters. And I think the biggest one is the sort of anchoring. In other words, where people look at what they've gotten on their account and what has historically worked and what is the preferred meta. And when a new character comes out, the immediate question is, how does this new character fit into an existing team comp? Which is a completely weird way of asking it, because in a certain sense, if you ask this very same question about the rest of a cast that's obviously not in the meta, you'll find all sorts of reasons why certain characters are not in the meta, be they clunky, be it the fact that in order to pull off rotations you need to do some awkward things, etc, etc. So when you look at Yae Miko, you need to really be cognizant of what type of team comps, what sort of macro and micro environment you're setting up, and to ensure that you're giving her a fair representation in this, and perhaps also understand that perhaps the answer is she's just a character at the moment in which I personally cannot correctly evaluate at the moment. That might also be another reason. So let's look at Yae Miko's with all this background. Let's look at her elemental skill and elemental burst and why people have problems with it. So the biggest one that a lot of people have said is there's no situation in which you do not want to use all three of her charges. And in fact, I disagree. If you understand certain team comps and certain builds and so on, you could very easily instantly cast her E-swap off, do some other off-field DPS before switching back to Yae Miko, where she fills in the team's downtime by casting her other skills. How you distribute your damage in Genshin Impact, how you make that work via different teammates, can very easily offset the little loss of scalings that you lose out by not immediately casting all three of your abilities. And this is the thing that people don't really realize from a practical perspective. They just think that, oh, I need to put down Bennett, cast all three of my E abilities, and then we're all good. And it's just like, no, that's not how you should play this character. And I think leading on this is this idea that how you lay down the free turrets is irrelevant. And I think that's absolutely nonsense, particularly in these Spiral Abyss where you've got enemies that spawn at different locations and so on. If you're going to do a little triangle formation here and there, you are effectively reducing the effective range in which your turrets can target enemies. But if you place your turrets more widely apart, and you understand that if you're on a certain side of the Spiral Abyss and you lay out a straight line, then you're covering more area effectively with your turrets to hit enemies. Your turrets are still going to be linked, so they can still get the maximum talent scaling. And once you get to the other side, if you now replace your first turret by now your fourth, which will now sort of override it, then all three of your turrets are still going to be linked in a row. So, and that means you can traverse the one side of the abyss to another side where the enemies are spawning, whilst keeping the uptime, keeping the maximal coverage of your turrets, and still doing damage in the process without wasting stamina. So this idea that the choice of how you lay it down is irrelevant, maybe this might be used. I can understand why people might say this if they look at the overworld in Genshin Impact, but even in the overworld, I'd argue that this is such a fundamental misunderstanding of how the turrets work and how their ranges effectively work as well. The big thing is how they are linked, not how and what pattern you lay them down. Obviously, as a consequence, if you have these misunderstandings of a skill, you might say, well, casting free E's messes up rotations, in which it does not. And that's because people want to cast it whilst failing to understand that your entire team's got cooldowns, and what you want to do in Genshin Impact is you want to overlap cooldowns. So whilst you've got your Fischl E and your Kokomi E on the field, you want to fill in that downtime by casting your Yae Miko's free E abilities. That makes perfect sense, because what else is your Fischl and your Kokomi going to do? This is the thing. You need to not think of rotations as in, oh, how is Yae Miko going to fit into my current ride in National? You've got to really completely rethink this, understand how you can fit this in, instead of just trying to criticize this up front, because I can promise you, if you can't fit in the free castings of Yae Miko, then you're going to have trouble with Ayato that wants to be on the field for 6 seconds, and effectively the moment you remove him, you lose all his damage. So you've got to cast his ability during the downtime of your team, otherwise we're going to get the exact same criticism that can be applied to him as well. These things are, I know they're not always that obvious and apparent, but just to say that triple casting messes up rotations is a bit disingenuous, be honest. A lot of people have said they've got problems with her ability giving like energy, like particles over time, so it's spread out instead of just like one upfront particle generation. Like for instance, let's say you press Xingshu's E, you get a lot of little hydro particles, and then you can amp it up by using the sacrificial weapon series, get more particles, just battery it all out. A couple of things people need to understand is, with a 22-second cooldown on your elemental burst, like what's the point of having all of your particle generations at the beginning? And at the it's just like, from a rotations perspective, it won't always make that much sense if you want to have it all. Like having it spread out actually fits way better if you use her and Fischl and Raiden Shogun at the same time, than trying to get the most out of it, because once it's spread out, it means you can like much more easily like facilitate rotations with your other characters that can now collect those particles, because you do lose out on some energy when the characters that you intend to give the energy are off field, and if you get upfront particle generations, then you are forced to make a swap if you want other characters to have it, which can have different implications for your rotations as well. And again, people don't talk about these things because they understand certain macro strategies, but then when we get to the micro details, they still don't get it. And when they get the micro details right, they forget about the macro strategy. And again, this is all about those base assumptions being wrong. A lot of people have said her ability feels clunky. That you just need to understand how the tap and hold works with regards to pressing your E ability, well, with regards to pressing the direction keys and then pressing your E ability. So the clunkiness is just a skill issue, sorry to say it. The unnecessary field times can be weaved by using it during the overlap of your cooldowns. Let's say you're casting your elemental burst or your teammate's cooldown. So that's not really, that's more a fundamental problem with your rotations. Some people say they want it to iframe. It's not necessary because it's a spacing tool, not a dodging tool. If you want to iframe, just dash on Yae Miko. It's like people forget that you can still dash with Yae. You still have the exact same iframing abilities that you've got with other characters. The only problem that a lot of people don't know about is that you can't do more than double dash without triggering an internal cooldown on your dashing. Now, with characters like Ayaka and Mona being the exception, all characters in the game do have like a dashing internal cooldown. Now, what Yae Miko does is she effectively allows you to gain additional movement, and then you can either dash before using a E or afterwards. So you gain additional movements to overlap with that internal dash cooldown if you really so need it. And hence, when you understand this ability from a spacing perspective instead of a dodging perspective, it just makes way more sense. Now, yeah, that's just all I have to say on that. Some people have suggested fixes like putting all of her E on one cast to refresh the duration of her totems and not destroy it. Casting her E gives immediate, like, generates energy, etc. Again, these fixes are only fixes because you guys don't understand how to play the character or how to effectively use her elemental skill. It's going to take some time. I mean, even with Kokomi, since day one, I said all the things I said about Kokomi, and guess what? Months later, they're all true, and people are like, oh yeah, now we now actually finally see the utility. This very weird focus on just damage is something the community must get out of. And that leads me very nicely to my next point. The majority of her powers in a burst. Again, what team comp are you playing? Are you going to force her to be with Bennett? In that case, yes. If you distribute that power by sort of trying to put the hyper carrying potential onto her, then that is the case. But if you play her in something like a Taser team comp, then you'll find that your elemental skill, pretty much like the additional damage you get by sort of constantly swirling, triggering VV, getting like high elemental mastery and so on, is going to very quickly outpace your elemental burst. And in fact, her constellations empower her E ability, not her elemental burst. At C6, my Yae Miko very quickly outticks her elemental burst, so the utility of her elemental burst is certainly not always in her damage. There's something else here about reactions. I'm not going to go into that. A lot of people have said that because her elemental burst has got a high cost, developers want to sell you like the solution via constellations, which in my opinion is completely wrong. Effectively, once you get C1, you're just reducing your elemental burst cost, which means your artifacts can now be redistributed from ER to more like attack percentage, crit rate, crit damage. So in effect, the constellation itself enables you to do more damage if you play with it cleverly, and as well it enables you to have smoother rotations and so on. So it's not just an energy efficient constellation, it's the same as Hu Tao's Constellation 1. It's not just all about not allowing you to waste stamina, it directly increases your DPS. It's the same with Eula C2. Suddenly the 9-second hold E is now a 3-second, I think 4-second, whatever cooldown. So again, all the clunkiness of characters that's also happened in the past, other 5 stars having like so-called solutions via their constellations, this is not something new, this is not something unique to Yae Miko. In fact, it irritates me when I look at Chinese speedrunning forums and like the low investment tier explicitly states C2 Raiden and then 3 other 4 stars with 4-star weapons. It's just like, really guys? We haven't even had a Raiden Shogun rerun and the low investment tier is like considered at C2. It's just like when I hear things like that from different people, it's just like, well, how do you even criticize this? You're just basically telling me you've run out of money, so you just want a reason to complain. And even if you're an F2P player and you don't have the Primo Gems, understand you've got 20 days before pulling for Yae Miko. No one forced you to pull Yae Miko day 1. You've got 20 days to decide, given all the information on the internet, do I want this character? So I think a lot of people just rushed into with Yae Miko before properly understanding the full implications of having her. And I think that has sort of bitten a lot of them, and now they're like very sort of like spiteful about it. A lot of people have said as well that resetting her E wastes time. Again, you can overlap this with cooldown, animation cancelled while her burst is casting down. So no, I do not agree. Yes, her cooldowns are low in any case, but think about it this way. Once you pair, I'm just going to use an example. You pair her with Raiden, your Raiden does her entry charge attack cancelling, and you do sort of like dash cancelling and all of that. Your stamina bar is going to be low. You've done what Theory Crafters wanted you to do. You've done all the animation cancels, all the charge attacks. Your stamina bar is low. So what do? You swap to Yae Miko. You use her elemental burst, so you're slowly regenerating some stamina. Now you're repositioning using her E, again saving stamina. Now you can swap to another character and you can dash cancel, animation cancel. You've got that stamina, you've got that optionality there, and that is enabled by resetting your E cooldowns. Again, something practical that not a lot of people think about because they do not play at the highest skill ceiling of the game. But when you do, things like these become very, very obvious. So no, it's not something that is unique and that is forced by the developers to feel unique. It is you, again, not understanding how Yae Miko works. People say that her EM passive is problematic. No, it's not, because whilst you don't build her with EM, she can effectively utilize EM from other characters in the game to not only increase her reaction damage, but the damage on her E as well. So that's 2 sources of damage that you are increasing, which is quite strong if you start adding up and attributing those additional increases in damage. Again, it's just a bit of people not understanding how to attribute maths, understanding the distribution of maths and what the contribution of this passive is to the outgoing damage of the team. And lastly, some people complain that her signature weapon is too perfectly designed for her and it's too niche as a result. Again, nicheness, generality, that is player preference, that's up to you. I think it's perfectly fine. So what's unique about her? What's unique about Yae Miko? Quite a lot. Do you know what's also unique about her? Showing me exactly why people make fundamental assumptions and they've got fundamental biases when it comes to evaluating characters, and that they are very contradictory in giving a certain character a certain treatment whilst forgetting that other characters have had very similar issues in the past. It's almost like the myopia in the community is absolutely crazy. Does MiHoYo do everything perfectly? No. Do they deserve to be criticized? Yes. Do they make lots of mistakes? Don't they listen to the community? Yes. Hoyoverse does a lot of things wrong. I agree. But honestly, Yae Miko, in my opinion, is not one of them, despite all the massive conspiracies with people not even fully reading the artifacts and so on. That's it, guys. That's what I wanted to say. Cheers.